Hi, and welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and I'm so glad that you joined us here today. Just a reminder to please like and share and rate this podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Rating the podcast helps us become more visible to other people and helps us to show up on their feed. Help us get the word out so that it can help and impact other women and other people going through grief who might feel alone and abandoned. Welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and this week I have with me Mallory Burke. I was first introduced to Mallory at my church when a friend told me that there were women in our church who might need to hear my story and also have an opportunity to tell theirs. So Mallory and another woman came over to my house one night and shared their painful yet beautiful stories of loss and hope. So welcome, Mallory. I'm so glad you're here with us today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be on today.
So I'm wondering if you can tell me just a little bit about yourself and your experiences with grief.
Yeah. So my husband Drew and we've been married for 6.5 years, and we had been married for a few years when we decided that we wanted to start trying for kids.
Mm-hmm.
I think we very naively thought we would just get pregnant instantly.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not the case for us. We actually ended up entering into a season of infertility for close to 2 years. And during that time, we tried for a few months, went to the doctor, found out I actually had a benign tumor on one of my ovaries. They were like, hey, we need to remove this, went into surgery, also found out I had endometriosis, which we were kind of thinking, okay, we got these things fixed, now we'll get pregnant. And that was also not the case. We had about 6 more months of infertility, and that's when we started to see a fertility doctor. And it was through there that they started some fertility treatments on me. And after a few months, it worked and we became pregnant. And I remember just this sense of relief of like, okay, this season of waiting is over. This season of grieving almost of infertility is over. But actually, we were about to enter into an even more heartbreaking season.
So before you go on to that season, I want to circle back to, you mentioned grieving and infertility. And that is something that a lot of people might look at and say, well, I don't understand that. Like, that's an unseen. I know I had on our podcast a friend of ours, Kelsey Sanders, and she talked about what's called ambiguous grief, which is kind of like this grief that we are experiencing that no one else can really see or understand. It's under the surface. We're dealing with it maybe privately or just with our family, but nobody else really understands. So can you share a little bit about maybe that grief during infertility?
Yeah. I feel like Kelsey's right. It's kind of an unseen battle that you're on, because for us personally, only a few people knew that we were trying to have a baby. And so we didn't want to tell anybody. We didn't tell our family, because you also want it to be private and exciting between you and your spouse. You also want it to be exciting and a surprise when you tell people you're pregnant.
Right.
And so we kind of just kept it close to our hearts. And then after about a year, it was kind of like, hey, we're struggling. And we opened up to some people. But the majority of people in my life did not know we were trying. And so it was a very, very, very lonely season, because it was kind of like a silent season of grieving. And the people we did invite into our lives to tell them about, there was really only so much they could do. It's not like a death where people can tangibly show up and drop things off, which I'll talk about later after our loss. But it's kind of just like you tell them, hey, we're trying for a baby. And they're like, that's so sad. We're praying for you. But there's really nothing that they can do tangibly to help you feel better.
Right.
And so it is a grief in a sense of, you are grieving. I was grieving so hard to be a mom, and all I wanted was to become a mom, and that wasn't happening. And there was nothing I could do about it.
And so what was your relationship with God during that part? Like, did that shift or change, or did you have any questions for God, or did you really just, lean into him and find peace?
Yeah, I feel like, I don't feel like I leaned into him the
Mhm.
way that I did after my loss. Looking back, I would say my relationship with God during infertility was probably mediocre.
Mm.
Um, I don't feel like looking back, I was like, wow, I really trusted him. But I also don't feel like I was distant from him. I think during that season, I wanted so much control that I was really just actually holding on very tightly to my own self-control, and I was not trusting him at all. I
Yeah.
think if I can look back and be honest, I don't think I was trusting that he was going to lead us through that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So continuing on, you went through all these years of infertility, grief through that infertility, and then what happened after that?
So we got pregnant after about 2 years, and a few weeks after finding out we were pregnant, we hadn't told anybody. I started to miscarry,
Mm,
and I remember that day so vividly.
mm,
Like every single detail of that day feels like it's just sketched into my mind forever. That morning, when you're seeing a fertility specialist and you get pregnant, they monitor your HCG levels.
mhm,
And so that morning, I had just gone in for blood work to make sure that those levels were rising. They had been rising the last few weeks. So, really, I didn't have anything to worry about. It was just protocol, you go in. I had that appointment. I went to work. And then that afternoon at work, I went to the restroom with a coworker and saw that I had began to bleed.
mm.
And in my gut, I knew exactly what was happening. But again, nobody knew I was pregnant. And so I
Yeah.
couldn't share with anyone at work, what was happening. I just
Yeah.
had to go back into the office
Mhm.
and wait for that phone call from the nurse, from the doctor, to confirm that my levels were rising, even though in that moment I knew they probably were not going to call with good news like they had been
Mm.
the last few
Mhm.
weeks.
Mhm.
And so my doctor eventually ended up calling me and let me know that my levels had actually stalled. They did not increase, but they did not decrease.
Yeah.
And through that, we found out I was actually not only having a miscarriage, but an ectopic pregnancy.
Mhm.
And that basically just, means that the baby is not in your uterus.
Mhm.
And this can be life threatening. And so the doctors immediately were like, hey, we've got to take action. And so they gave me a chemo injection, and that kind of helps pass the baby in a healthy way where it doesn't put my life in jeopardy. And that medication made me incredibly sick. It gives
Mm.
you the effects of chemo on a lighter
Oh,
scale.
wow.
And that just made the grieving process so much more
Right.
brutal,
Right.
because here you are losing your baby, but now you're also throwing up constantly
Mhm.
and not really able to get off the couch. And so it just made it even more confusing and heartbreaking.
Mm. Oh my goodness. And to start that, start the process at work, we did just have a podcast a few weeks ago talking about losing a baby or starting the loss at work. And that's
Mm,
such an uncomfortable place to be because like you said, nobody really knows what's going on around you. And I know for me, when that happened to me, I felt like if anybody even looked at me the wrong way, I was going to lose it.
mm,
Because
yes.
you're carrying all of that burden and that grief all alone in that moment. And so I
Hmm.
can't even imagine. And then to have um, that medication on top of the grief, on top of all that your body is going through, because even though it's early, your body is still producing all those hormones. Your levels were rising. Everybody was doing,
Yes.
so before you had a miscarriage, did you
Hmm.
have any idea or have anyone talk to you or family members talk about their own miscarriages? Did you have any experience like or knowledge about it before it happened to you?
My sister, my older sister, she's 7 years older than me. She had actually just experienced six miscarriages back to
Oh,
back
wow.
right before me.
Wow.
When I had my miscarriage, she was 9 months pregnant with her miracle baby.
Mm,
So the six losses were very recent
yep.
when I had mine. And so, I was familiar with it, but honestly, I had zero idea
Mm,
what she had gone through.
Mm-hmm.
And my sister didn't talk much about her losses. She grieved much more privately.
Yeah.
And so I truly did not know how badly she was hurting
Yeah.
until I experienced my own loss. And
Wow.
I've actually gone to her several times after my loss, just apologizing to her, saying, I'm so sorry that I was not there for you in the way that I should have been, because now I realize how badly you were hurting.
Yeah.
And she showed up day in and day out for me
Oh, wow.
after my loss, because she knew how bad it hurt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It changes us. It's unfortunate that our empathy is stronger after, that we have to
Mm-hmm.
experience that as well. But it does help. We understand it now. And,
Yeah.
so your sister, having gone through that, understood exactly what you needed,
Yeah.
through your loss. Talk a little bit, if you feel comfortable enough, about, um, any sadness or depression or anything after, your loss.
So after my loss, I was just so sad.
Mhm.
Like there's really no other word that I can describe. Maybe depressed, but it was just like this deep, dark sadness.
Mhm.
And I remember telling a friend, she texted me and checked on me and said, how are you feeling? And I said, it hurts so much.
Mhm.
And she said, physically? And I said, no, just emotionally. And my heart just aches and it hurts. Um, and I felt like that sadness, honestly, was never going to go
Oh,
away.
yeah.
Like I just remember crying constantly every single day, just crying, pleading with the Lord,
Mhm.
just please just don't let this be happening.
Yeah.
Make sure that they got the levels wrong, that this is just spotting. It's just normal. Just please don't take my
Oh,
baby.
yeah.
And that's not what happened. I did end up losing the baby, but I just remember living in this state for a solid week of just in disbelief, but also just great sorrow.
Mhm.
And it was horrible. I mean, it's truly just like a pain like none other that like you said, you really can't relate until you go through
It's
it.
true.
And it's a club that nobody wants to be a part of when
No.
it does happen.
And, that sadness, there is really no way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
It's I say the word visceral because it's without logic. It's coursing through your whole body. Your whole body, all your emotions, everything is reacting to this pain and this grief and it should feel like it hurts so much. It should be a physical pain. You know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? Like that
Yeah.
emotional pain does hurt so much that you're like, if it was physical, maybe people would understand it better because, you
Yeah.
know,
And like you said,
Mm.
your hormones are already raging. Your body's confused because you were pregnant and now you're not. And those hormones are sometimes out of our control. I mean,
Absolutely.
they run wild.
Yes.
So
Oh, yes.
that adds to it.
Um, so you kind of shared a little bit about your sister and how she supported you and, um, was there for you after your loss. How was the response of your church, after your
Mm.
loss and other friends that were close to you?
So I was actually on staff at our church when this happened. So I feel like these two categories of friends and church kind of merged together for
Mhm.
me a little bit during this season. Um, I genuinely did feel so loved by everyone.
Mm.
I got that phone call when I was at work, and so I obviously immediately left. I let one coworker know what was going on. She shared with the rest of my coworkers, and that night there was dinner on our
Oh,
doorstep.
that's amazing.
And we just felt so loved and we felt so seen by our people.
Mhm.
I actually had lost our baby the week before my birthday. And so
Oh.
every day that week, a different coworker dropped off a gift on our doorstep.
Oh my gosh.
And
Oh.
so it was such a small thing,
Mhm.
but it just truly felt like, okay, we're not doing this alone. We have people who love us. We have people who are just in prayer for us
Yes.
during this.
Yes.
And like I said, I was recovering from that chemo injection. And
Mhm.
so I was mainly just on the couch during that time. But my mom flew from Kansas to South Carolina to stay with us for about a week and a half while I recovered. And she said, "You have the most incredible community here."
Mm.
She was like, "I can't sit down longer for half an hour because I'm having to get up to answer the door
Oh,
because
wow.
people were just dropping things off." And
Mhm.
it was just so sweet. And I think that was the first season we had gone through where we were just genuinely grieving.
Yeah.
And I was also physically healing.
Yeah.
And just to see the way that our church and our friends stepped up, it really meant a lot to me.
That's amazing, and I love those. I'd
Yeah.
love to hear those stories of, the community just surrounding the grieving and supporting and helping and loving. Some people might say, "Well, I don't want all that. I don't want people coming to my house."
Hmm.
And so I think that there could be ways that we can communicate that. We could just say,
Yeah.
"We're open to having things dropped off," like you said, dinner on your doorstep. We're open to having people texting us, but we love you, but here we do need some boundaries, and I think both ways
Hmm.
are necessary, are good, and having our um being vocal about what we need is important.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, it totally depends, I think, on the person's personality
Mhm.
as well. I am naturally an extrovert, but I will say during those 2 weeks, I didn't want to see
Yeah.
anybody. I didn't want to interact with anyone. So I wasn't the one answering the door.
Yeah.
And I think that is what meant a lot to me is people would text me, but a
Mhm.
lot of times I didn't even respond because I just felt like I couldn't even hold a conversation.
Yeah.
But it was just the tangible ways that people were loving on us that meant the most.
Yeah.
And I think Drew and I learned a lot during that season of how to care for others
Oh, yeah.
because of how well we were cared for.
Oh,
And I remember us sitting there one night saying, "This changes everything for us.
oh,
Like, we want to show up for people the way that people have showed up for us." And we
yeah.
still talk about that to this day. And it's been, 4 years since our loss. And that marked us forever of how well we were loved.
Oh, man. Well, I love hearing those stories of how, people surround you, but is there any way or anything, looking back, that maybe the church or people could have done different or better? And if there isn't, that's great, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious.
I would say my biggest piece of advice for anybody who's walking through a loved one miscarrying is to just be there.
Mm,
We had the vast majority were, but then there were people, who would give their unsolicited advice.
yeah.
I had crazy conversations with people
Oh,
sometimes.
yes.
If you want to get pregnant or not have another miscarriage, try this, this, and
Oh,
this.
yeah.
And it was like, oh no, I don't want to know that. um, or just the people who, and we experienced this through infertility, the people who would talk negatively about their children to
Mm.
try and make us feel better. Like,
Oh,
"Oh, are you sure you want this? You sure you want
oh,
this? This is crazy." And it's
yeah.
like, "No, we
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say something that I even learned through this season is I think it's very normal for us to ask people, "How are you doing?"
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
the answer is not good.
Right.
The person's not doing good. And so just to text someone, say, "How are you doing?" Most of the time, I didn't even respond to those
Yeah.
because
You don't
I'm
know
not doing
how.
well.
Right. Right.
Um, and I think the second thing I learned not to say to anybody anymore is, "Let us know if we can do
Yes.
anything," because I'm not going to let you know.
Absolutely.
So,
Yep.
but I think that is just and up until walking through that season, I did those two things all the
Oh,
time. "How
yeah.
are you doing?" And let us know if we can do
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. And then
Well, that person is not going to reach out and say, "Oh, actually, you could cook me dinner tonight."
right.
That
Well,
we're not going to do
we
that.
feel we're sad enough, and we deal with our own guilt and shame during this season. We don't need to add to that,
Yes.
you know.
So I think that just showed me the people who just never even texted me. I mean, you can text people. It meant a lot to
Oh,
me to know
yes.
people were,
I loved it.
but not putting it on my plate
Yeah.
of saying, "Hey, let us know if you
Yeah.
can do anything," because then that just feels like an extra burden for me.
Yeah. Yes.
But to just show up, just cook the meal,
Mhm.
send the DoorDash gift card, deliver a care package, get them flowers. There are so many tangible ways you can love on people
Mhm.
other than just asking, "What can I do for you?"
And not feel like, don't second guess yourself. Like, I get stuck in the,
Mhm.
"Well, I'm gonna buy them a candle and some socks," and then I'm like,
Mhm.
"Oh, what if they don't like the smell of the candle? Ooh, what
Yeah.
if they don't like fuzzy socks? What do I" like, just do it. And if they
Yeah.
don't like it, then
Nobody's gonna care, and if they don't like it, they won't
they'll
use
throw it
it.
away. Like, who cares? But
Yeah.
coming to the house or thinking of them, that's what's important, you know? But
Yes.
you were talking
Yeah.
about, like, don't put that burden on you. The, like, buzzword I'm hearing on social media a lot is mental load.
Mm.
And, like, how certain, like, especially talking about husbands and wives, in their interactions with each other, instead of just doing the work of looking for something or
Mhm.
ask or seeing, oh, hey, the dishes need to be cleaned up after dinner, instead of saying, should I clean the dishes, or do you know, like, just doing it, like, just doing the
Yeah.
action instead of putting that burden back onto the other person. And I feel like when
Yes.
you say, just let me know what you need, that's putting that mental load. And the other thing,
Mhm.
as I've talked before, is don't really ask them what they want for dinner, because they can't decide. If there's the
Yes.
allergies or something, like, be aware of that, but, like, just do something. And
Yeah, just show up. Yeah,
yeah,
just be there. Yeah.
absolutely. So what was your, so we talked a little bit about your walk with God when you were during the infertility. And you said you didn't really lean in, there was, your walk with God was a little different then. What was your walk with God or your experiences with God during your loss? Did you feel at any point that he was actually with you, grieving with you? Did you feel abandoned by him? Like, what was that relationship like?
Um, I feel like when a lot of people go through things like this, they really struggle with feeling angry
Mm,
at God, which makes complete sense. I I never really felt angry, but I would say to summarize how I felt towards God is just confused.
yeah,
I was very confused and I had a lot of questions. My main question being, how could you allow this to happen after 2 years of trying?
right,
Um, I had questions of women who get pregnant who aren't even trying to get pregnant.
right.
And I'm like, okay, God, I'm in a committed marriage, financially stable, ready, trying, and you allow me to have it almost like a teaser, and then you allow my baby to go away,
Yeah, right.
and that was so confusing to
Oh,
me.
yeah.
And Drew and I really handled the grief differently. I feel like he really struggled with anger, whereas I just struggled with numbness
Yeah.
and confusion towards the Lord, honestly.
So, grieving differently, that's a
Mm,
very common thing in marriages.
yes.
We are different people. We all have our different quirks and different ways of dealing with things and handling things. And the statistics for surviving marriages after loss are very, there's a lot of divorce after loss.
Mhm.
So how did you guys navigate your differences in grieving?
So I really I said earlier, I'm an extrovert. I love to be around people, but I did the opposite of that during this grieving season. I really turned into a hermit. I
Mm.
stayed at home, didn't want to talk to people. Drew really threw himself into work
Uh,
during that season. And I found him, working longer days, or when he was home, he was working. And we actually spoke at a leadership conference a few years ago, and we both talked about this. We were asked to speak on how we handled grief differently.
mm,
And so it's been neat to look back on knowing that we handled it so
right.
differently. And ultimately, that really brought us apart from one another.
Mm,
Um, I remember walking through this grieving season with another friend who had lost her child, and her husband, I felt like we're on the same page. They were so close.
mm,
And I was so jealous of that.
mhm.
I remember her telling me, like, all I want to do is be with my husband. And
Oh,
I'm like, man, I don't feel that right now. I feel like we're on separate wavelengths
yeah.
right now. He's busy with work. I don't want to talk to anyone. And it was like that for a little bit. We really grieved separately, honestly.
Mm,
And it was not until a few months later that we could kind of come back and be like, okay, wow, we did that separately, but how can we avoid that from happening again?
mhm.
And having a lot of honest conversations with one another about it
Yeah,
really
wow.
helped us.
So did you seek counseling in any way, or any kind of
We
therapy?
did.
Mhm.
Yes, we went to a Christian marriage counselor. We only went a couple times, but it honestly just helped us to be able to say how we were feeling to a third party. And not that we were even angry with one another,
Right.
we just didn't feel close to one
Mhm,
another.
mhm,
But to be able to sit there and just vocalize how we each were feeling to somebody else,
mhm.
and that person kind of repeating it to the other spouse,
Yeah,
that's what kind of made us click of like, oh, you're not feeling loved in this way,
yeah,
because you're grieving in this way, whereas
yeah.
I'm not grieving that way. I don't feel angry like
Mhm.
you do, and you don't feel like you want to sit in your house with the curtains closed like I do.
Right.
So it was just learning that really what was happening is we were grieving a terrible loss, but differently.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that is important with therapy is to understand that it is a safe place where there's a third
Hmm.
party to kind like you said, I think the repeating back is very important in
Yes.
therapy. But to just
Yes.
say, I have a place that I can go and we can say what needs to be said. And we're not
Hmm.
pushing it, shoving it, stuffing it. We're not harboring bitter feelings, that we have this tool for us. Because I know sometimes therapy, people look at that even today and are like, "Oh, I don't need therapy." But it's
Yeah.
just really a good safe place. And I think if we
Hmm.
can normalize that and say, "No, this is a good thing. This is
Yes,
healthy for
absolutely.
us to do that."
Yes.
Um,
Yes, to normalize it.
yeah. So
Yes.
after you go through your grieving process, how long until you guys were ready to start again?
We started trying our again, we couldn't get pregnant on our own, so it was kind of like the conversation of when do we go back to the fertility
Mm.
specialist. And we had said we would give ourselves 6 months. After you have an ectopic pregnancy, you physically can't get pregnant for 3 months,
Oh, okay.
just because of the danger of your body undergoing that again. So we knew we had to at least wait 3 months, which was totally fine with us because we're in the depths of grief. But we surprisingly only waited 4 months instead of six.
Okay.
And, it kind of just was one week that we were like, hey, where are you at with this? Because I think I'm ready to start trying again.
Mhm.
And we had to have some conversations about it. And I think I was surprised when we were both on the same page with it.
Mm.
Um, but I think what it was just learning that we can still be grieving, but we can also start to move on and we can
Yeah.
start to experience joy again.
Mm.
And that was something that was really eye opening to me. I always thought grief and joy were opposites,
Mm, mhm.
but they're actually not. They can coexist.
Absolutely.
And you can experience this horrible tragedy and you can grieve, then you can also experience joy all at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's only through Christ that both things can exist at the same time.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but that is kind of how we started to move forward. And I hate even saying move on because we'll never move on from the loss of our baby, but to move forward, I guess, would be a good way to word it. That we kind of were in the season of like, okay, we're still sad, but we're moving forward and we're experiencing joy again, and let's talk about our future
Yeah.
again, and let's talk about expanding our family and see what God has in store for us.
Mm.
So
So, did you get pregnant again?
we did get
Okay.
pregnant again. He is 2.5 years old now.
Okay. And how was that pregnancy?
Yeah. That pregnancy was a little scary in the beginning, as I think any woman who has had a loss would say.
Yes.
Until you experience a loss, you kind of are just naive, I think, a
Yeah.
little bit to pregnancy and the complications, or at least I was the first time I got pregnant.
Right.
And after getting pregnant again, we did do fertility treatments. And we were successful the first month of treatment,
Wow.
which was incredible and a miracle. And we were so excited. But we were also scared.
Mhm.
And I remember the day after getting my positive pregnancy test, I was driving home from work, and I remember just sobbing and talking to the Lord and saying, I can't do this again.
Oh,
If
yeah.
I just cannot lose another baby. So please, please help this baby to to be healthy, to grow strong,
Yeah.
to grow for 9 more months,
Mm-hmm.
and just protect us from going through this again, because I don't think I can do
Right.
it.
Right.
And it was probably one of the most honest conversations I've had with God, where I was just talking very bluntly to him while also sobbing and just laying it all out of exactly how I felt.
Mm-hmm.
And really, after that moment in the car, I just felt so much peace going forward in my pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember coming home and telling Drew, this baby is going to make it, and we're going to meet this baby one day.
Nice.
And he was like, whoa, I'm not on that page yet. I'm still really scared. Let's see how the next appointments go. And I was like, no, this is happening. We're meeting this baby.
Oh, yeah.
And that's from the Lord. I mean, that's not anything I could do or any kind of confirmation anyone else could give me, but truly a gift from the Lord to have that peace moving forward.
Absolutely. And so pretty uncomplicated delivery. Moving forward over. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, we went to 39 weeks. I was induced, and we had Walker, and he is hilarious. He's 2.5 now, healthy, and we have always called him from day one our little miracle baby.
Yeah, totally. He is very adorable. So, so after you had Walker, how long was it before you got pregnant again?
It was, I want to say, 1.5 years. Okay. We got pregnant again, which is wild, because 1.5 years after we had him, we started talking about fertility treatments of, okay, we've never been able to get pregnant on our own. Should we start going back to the specialist? And this is a crazy story, because we decided, let's just try for funsies. But obviously nothing's going to happen, because we have to have treatment.
Right.
The week after, I call my fertility doctor and I say, hey, we want to start trying again. Would love a consult, just to get back in. There's certain things you have to do before you start trying. And they were like, great, come in next Thursday. I text Drew and I say, hey, we have an appointment next Thursday. If you could take off work for an hour and meet me there. He's like, great. Well, then I just sat on the couch and I thought, should I take a pregnancy test? I had no reason to think I was pregnant, honestly. But I was like, I'm just going to take one. I mean, they're going to take it for me when I go next week, so might as well just take it. I took a pregnancy test. I forgot about it. That is how little thought I gave it. I walked away. I came back, and it was positive.
Oh, my gosh.
And I was so incredibly shocked. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I have to think of a cool way to tell Drew. I've never been able to tell him in a fun way, because when it's fertility treatment, they know, I rush to the store with Walker. I get him a shirt that says brother, and Drew walks in and sees the shirt. And I mean, he was shocked, because I had just told him 3 hours earlier we were going to the fertility doctor.
Oh my gosh.
And so we got pregnant. And it was a shock and an absolute miracle.
Oh, that is amazing. So, so talk to me a little bit about what that pregnancy was like.
Yeah. So, at 22 weeks with our second pregnancy, or our second baby, we went in for our anatomy scan, and really didn't give it a second thought, just protocol, going for your anatomy scan. And it was there we actually knew the ultrasound tech. She went to church with us, and I could tell something was wrong. She got kind of quiet, and then she was kind of explaining some things to us, but said, the doctor is going to talk to you more. Turns out that I had complete placenta previa, which, some women have, not too big of a deal, but there's some limitations you have to be on. But the most concerning part was that I also had a subchorionic hemorrhage that led to a partial placenta abruption. And basically what that meant is I just had a lot of internal bleeding. And that was kind of starting to cause an abruption. The amount of bleeding I had, the doctor said, looked like somebody who had been in a traumatic car accident.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And so there was no reason for this. It just happened. I was not in a car accident. I didn't fall. I didn't take any hits. It just happened.
Yeah.
And so after I met with the doctor, they said, hey, we want to get you into maternal fetal tomorrow morning. Until then, you're on complete bed rest. Do not get up other than to use the bathroom or the shower. And we were just completely blindsided at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can imagine how scary that first night was when we went home and we had zero answers other than I wasn't allowed to get up.
Right.
And so the next morning we met with maternal fetal and they looked at the internal bleeding again. And I mean, it was so much blood. Like you could see the blood just moving on the screen that's just sitting inside of me around the baby. And the doctor told us, you know, you are going to lose this and it can be detrimental to your life and also your baby's life.
Oh, wow.
And so I was immediately put on bed rest and close supervision. And they said, you're on bed rest, honestly, until this resolves itself. But it wasn't even like, hey, this is going to resolve itself before the baby comes. It was like, hey, this is probably until you deliver this baby. And we don't know when that will be, depending on when you start bleeding.
Right. Because there was something, I remember you telling me that there was like an amount of time you had if you had started bleeding that you had to get to the hospital.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we lived about 25 minutes from the hospital at this point, and he said, when you start bleeding, you don't have time to call an ambulance. This will be catastrophic. The amount of blood that you will lose. You get in the truck, and he looked at Drew and he said, you turn your hazards on and you drive as fast as you can to get her to the hospital. Wow. He said it would not hurt to call the police and just say, hey, this is what's going on. We would love an escort or something like that. Whatever you can do to get there as quickly as possible. And also call triage and let them know that you're on your way so they can be outside and ready to tend to you when you get there.
Wow.
So yeah, he definitely let us know the severity of it. And he did tell me that, you know, if you start to bleed out, his priority is to save my life and not my baby's life, which is not what any mother wants to hear.
And all of this is happening and you have a toddler at home.
Yes.
You're not allowed to pick them up. You're not allowed to get out, get off. And we know toddlers do not sit still.
Yes.
And so you have this, on top of that, you have this caring of a young person in your home. You now have these massive what ifs and unknowns. You don't know if you're going to be able to save your life or the baby's life. Is it going to be one or the other or both? Can we save both? Like all of those questions. What was that like emotionally for you at this point in the pregnancy?
Yeah. There were a lot of ups and downs. I would have moments where I was so scared for two reasons. My main priority being I thought I was going to lose my baby. The second fear I had was, am I going to bleed out and die? And I've never thought about that before up until this scenario of dying. It's not something I spent time thinking about. But every night I would go to bed and wonder, okay, am I going to bleed out while I'm asleep and not know? Is Drew going to wake up? And I would find myself through the night just patting the bed next to me, wondering if I was laying in blood.
Oh, wow.
And that messes, with a person every day, wondering if that's going to happen, all while also wondering what's going to happen to my baby.
Yep.
And so I had a lot of dark days and a lot of fear-based days. I lived in a lot of fear for many months. And it was really, really hard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So it's similar, not exact, but similar to when we got the diagnosis about Ezekiel. We were told he could pass at any moment. We were never given, he will survive to, no, but he's going to pass. So living every day, every week, we defied the doctors by carrying him to 33 weeks. They thought he would pass at 16, but it is that
it is hard to describe to somebody what that fear is, the living every
Mhm.
day not knowing, is today the day? Is it
Yes.
going to happen today that I'm going to
Mhm.
lose my baby, that I'm gonna bleed out, that, and just that weighs on you emotionally, physically, spiritually. I mean, it is a weight that,
Yeah.
I don't think, and I hope not a lot of people can identify with.
Mhm.
So, with me, it was a time where I spent a lot of time diving into the scriptures and really wrestling. I wouldn't say leaning into God yet,
Yeah.
but it was a lot of wrestling.
Mhm.
I'm rereading Job for like the 20th time, and there are phrases in there that he is speaking out, and I'm like, yes, I feel that exactly.
Can
I
relate.
totally understand what you're saying. So, what was going on between you and God at this point?
So earlier I said when I went through my miscarriage, I didn't really struggle with anger.
Mm,
But I don't think I can say that for this season.
mm,
Anger wasn't the only emotion that I felt, but I definitely went through phases. Like you said, I wrestled in my relationship with him. I was angry. I was confused.
yeah.
I was sad. I was scared. Pretty much every emotion you could have is what I felt from the moment I woke up until I went to bed.
Mhm.
And I also was on bed rest.
Yeah.
So I had nothing else to do
Yes.
but to sit there and be in my thoughts. And something that was very helpful for me is I had a friend give me a journal. I think the brand is called Write Your Word.
Mm.
And you can get a journal for different things. And so the one she gave me was specific to worship.
Oh.
And which is not honestly what I would have thought to get during that
Yeah.
season because I'm like, I don't feel like I really want to worship him right now.
Mhm.
But she knew that's what I needed, and she was right. And I would sit there because I was on bed rest,
Yep.
and I had unlimited time to spend with him. And I would just sit there and I would write out my prayers.
Mm.
I would spend time in scripture. I would wrestle with it. I learned a lot. And I started writing out my prayer requests specifically for each doctor's appointment because I was going 1 to 2 times a week where they were monitoring me and the baby. Um, and each time that a prayer would get answered, I would go back and I would highlight it.
Mm.
And I still have that journal now where I can just thumb through the journal and see all of the highlighted
Oh,
words.
that's amazing.
And it's so neat. I would highly recommend anybody to start doing that. It was a friend who actually told me that's what she does in her quiet time.
Oh.
And it was the best thing I ever started implementing because when you start to go through hard seasons, you start to doubt the faithfulness and the goodness of God.
Absolutely.
And to have a tangible way to just look at this journal and thumb through it and see all the ways that he's already been faithful.
Yeah.
He's already answered these
Mhm.
prayer requests. That is honestly what got me through each day was like, okay, he's
Yeah.
carried me this far. He carried us through the season of grief when we lost our first baby. And he's going to carry us through this. And I don't know what that may look like, but he's going to be
Yeah.
here. And that's all that I needed to know.
Mm.
And I really didn't know how our story was going to
Right.
end.
Right.
But I knew that he was going to be faithful to the end.
And yeah.
And that was really neat for me to really meditate on during those months of bed rest.
And I love that the book she gave you was Worship.
Mm-hmm.
We just had, and we just interviewed it. It's not airing yet. Maybe by the time yours airs, the episode will
Yeah.
air. But we talk about the idea, not that we worship through grief. I think a lot of people
Mm,
they can worship through their grief, and it's comforting and consoling to them and fills them, and it's great. But the idea that our grief is actually worship and can be
yeah.
considered worship to God, and not through the grief, but with the grief. It isn't like incense to God. And as we are
Mm,
grieving and suffering, that becomes praise to Him, glorifying to Him. It highlights what He is capable of doing. It highlights His his power and his majesty. And I just, and you can see that as you read Job even, and in the end when he comes and he answers Job one-on-one. And that's the whole point of this podcast too, is that God doesn't leave us in that grief. He is there with us through it, and not waiting for us to come out on the other side and then give him praise. He's with us in the moment as we are grieving and praising, and all of that is worshiping him. So I just love that.
And I think when you go through trials like this of losing your baby, or the unknown of what's going to happen to your child, it just leaves you feeling broken. At least for me, I felt brokenness in a way with both times, honestly, but brokenness in a way that I really didn't even know I could feel. And I felt like I had just come to the end of myself, of like, I have nothing left. I can't keep going. And I think what God was teaching me during that season was, you can't, because you're human. And it was actually the kindness of God to show me my human limitations, because it made room for him to show me that, he has no limitations.
Yes.
And for me to just lean into that and know that he is going to carry me through this, because he doesn't come to the end of himself like I did. And how gracious of him to put limitations on us, because we're able to lean on him in a way that we never would if we didn't go through these kinds of trials.
Absolutely. So we want to hear the ending of the story. So now I will say, this was during Christmas time, or was it? Because I remember coming to your house and there was still a Christmas tree up.
January. Yes. So I got put on bed rest the second week of January, and my decorations were still up. And then I physically couldn't take them down. Right. So I should have just left them up all year.
Right.
But yes, this was the beginning of 2024, the beginning of this year. In January is when I was put on bed rest. And after our first appointment, I asked the doctor, he had told me, my goal is to save you. And I said, well, my goal is for my baby to live. So I need you to tell me straight up, what is the survival rate here? Like, what are we looking at? And I need you to tell me every single week what his percentage of living is. And so he did. He told me each percentage of each week. And he said, hey, our goal is to make it to 26 weeks. And at 22 weeks, that felt like a lifetime away. That was a month away. And I was like, there's no way. And honestly, I don't think the doctor thought there was any way either. But we did. We made it to 26 weeks. And after that, we're like, okay, 28 weeks is third trimester. Let's see if we can get there. We made it to 28 weeks. And at this point, we just kept on trucking along. Each week, I made it with no bleeding. And I made it to 39 weeks without any bleeding.
Oh my gosh.
And we had our beautiful little miracle boy, our second miracle boy, Baker Allen Burke. And he is here, and he turned 6 months in 2 days.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And so the bleeding at one point, you said, didn't it start to like resolve itself? Like as you were going for scans?
Yes, it started. So the doctor said in the beginning, this blood is coming out. It wasn't really if, it was like when this happens. And then as each week we would go in, and sometimes news would be a lot worse. But then around 26 weeks, it was kind of like, hey, this amount of blood is getting less. And then around, 32 weeks, it was like, this blood is disappearing.
Wow.
And this doesn't happen. There's no scientific reason for this. And my doctor was just floored by it. He even called in another doctor at one point, like, do you see this? Like,
oh my God,
what is happening? And that new doctor said, well, is she bleeding a lot? And he said, no, she's experienced no bleeding. And they were like, what? How is this happening? And so it honestly confused them. It made no sense. And I just kind of chuckled, because I was like, well, we have a lot of people praying. And they were like, yeah, but scientifically, this makes no sense.
I love when your prayers defy science.
Yes. Yeah. So it was really crazy. No bleeding. And we made it to 39 weeks. I mean, truly an absolute miracle. And we could not have done it without the Lord and without everybody else around us. We had the best community during those 5 months.
And I think, as we close out here, I think that is the most important takeaway from your story that I see is the community you surround yourself with is essential, with the support they give you, with coming to the home, with praying for you, caring for you. And, when you're on bed rest, all of that, to not cloister ourselves, which is the temptation sometimes when we're going through hard things. I don't want to burden anybody. I don't want to share the details of this because it's too much for me. It's going to be too much for them. So I'm just going to keep it to myself. But really, ultimately, what Jesus wanted and what he established in the church was for us to dwell with one another and support one another and to open ourselves up and be vulnerable to each other so that the church can be his hands and feet to us during those times. And so that I see that as a beautiful picture in your story as to what the church can do. And I love it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it was incredible. And like I said, it has changed Drew and I forever. The group of people we had were incredible. And we are forever grateful that we can say we walked through these horrible seasons, but never once did we feel lonely through them. And that is not everybody's story, and we recognize that. And so we are so grateful for the people that God had put in our life during that time. He knew we needed them for sure.
Absolutely. So before we say goodbye, are there any plans for more Burke children?
I would like 4 or 5. If you could talk to Drew. We have compromised on 3, so we'll see how it goes. After my last pregnancy, I think we all need a little time to deal with all of that trauma.
Yeah, a little bit. A few years, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, give us a few years, but absolutely.
Well, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great holiday season.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Grieving with God podcast. I hope to see you again next week as we continue to explore what it looks like to grieve with God. Does God show up for us? In what ways does he show us that he is here for us in our sorrow? And how can we honor him as we walk through the tough times in our lives? Hope to see you again next week.